they're catching up, and so hopefully this week we'll have that. So thanks for being here. It's good to have you here. Thanks, Jimmy, for the reminder. Next week will be virtual. So maybe if you haven't been here for our understanding where we're going in the future, on November 7th, we talked about that. And what I'm doing, last week I did the same thing, just kind of giving a different take and look on where we're going as a church. And so I want to do that again today. We're in Acts chapter 16, and it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of really cool stories that we can learn from when we realize that, or ask the question to ourselves, what does it look like if we take the peace of God, the presence of Jesus in our heart, and get it out of our private life and live it out? And we got to ask ourselves that question. If it means rearranging your life, and I think it does, so it literally changes how you spend your money, how you organize your day, how you do justice and care for the poor, then it should be something public, right? And I think a lot of times we've made it to where, well, I should know how to say stuff. If you've been in the church for a while, or if you've been a Christian or whatever, that I need to learn how to present the gospel. And I think it's way, way more nuanced than that, that just having the right things to say doesn't necessarily mean I believe it. But how I live my life shows if I believe it or not. So I just wrote this down for myself. Like, do I look for stories? Do I look for changed lives, transformed lives? Do I look for the conversations or those surprise moments where the opportunity to show how I live my life is different? These experiences, those are the credible things. Those are the things worth looking for. And one thing that has become very apparent in our culture and society is the growth of this group of people called the nones, N-O-N-E-S, who are completely removing their experience of organized religion, faith, and just saying, I don't have anything. And it grew by, in the last decade, 20 million people have responded to saying, I don't have faith, I don't have anything. And so I think it becomes all the more important that those that call themselves followers of Christ are living this out in a way that is different. And it's not about just being a nice person or a moral person or an ethical person. That's great. And I know tons of nice, moral, ethical people. I think the difference is, has Jesus Christ completely altered the way you live your life? I think that's the question. So I want to look at some case studies, if you will, to be very doctoral, and how this message of Christ gets out into society and culture. The Apostle Paul, so again, we're looking at Acts, and Acts is basically stories about how the church grew after Jesus ascended to heaven and he released the disciples into the world to carry it on. And so the Apostle Paul was one of those, and he was a missionary, so meaning he was like an ambassador for this message, and he went to this city called Macedonia in Greece to start a church, plant a church in the biggest city called Philippi at the time. And all of the interactions that we're going to be talk about took place in this urban setting, which is very appropriate for us at All Saints. And so in our setting, it really helps us see what does it mean to live this faith out in the marketplace. And like if you are returning to work in your cubicle, if you're on Zoom, that's a whole new thing. What does it look like there? I don't know. Next door, the people that you hang out with, what does it look like? And so it's also going to show us really, as we move into the future of what our church is and becoming, what's it look like for us in a city like ours, who probably have seen a quicker acceleration of that group, the nones, that need to see what Jesus looks like, and that happens through us. So a guy named William Tyndale said this: the church exists for those outside of it. I think that's absolutely true. As much as we need this, and being together, and praying together, and worshiping together, and if that's something that warms your heart, then why not share it? Why not invite people into it? So look at 3 changed lives, and I'm not going to read the whole text because it's pretty long. It's Acts chapter 16, verses 13 to 33, and so I'm just going to read portions of it. So we see this first person. Her name is Lydia. She's a slave girl in that time. And in verse 13 of chapter 16, it says, "On the Sabbath, we," Paul's talking here, "went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place to pray. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there, and one of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God, and the Lord opened her heart to respond to the message of Paul." And so we see that she was a worshiper of God, and that means that she was a Gentile and had been raised to worship other gods. And now we see her attracted to the God of the Bible. Now she's meeting regularly to read the Bible with other believers. I guess we could call that a life group. And she was a business owner, and she wasn't a slave girl. She was the business owner. The next one's the slave girl. My apologies. So she was a business owner who was probably very wealthy, probably was a woman who had her life together, but maybe realized something was missing in her life. And I think that's another existential question, right? What do you do when you come across somebody who you begin to realize that they're missing something, they're looking for something? Is it that we have the answer? No. Do we have an understanding? Possibly. Is that something to present to somebody who's searching for that meaning? Yeah, I think so. But that takes discernment, that takes a willingness, it takes realizing that maybe as I live this out, they might not see it right away. So what is that? How do we live this out? And it's just walking with people. That's the big thing I want you to get here. Just being who you are, being transformed. And so this is why I think, and as I'm studying this, she was looking to the God of the Bible. I'm missing something. And Paul was speaking mainly to these women at this Bible study. So Paul showed up at this women's Bible study. How cool is that? We don't know exactly what, but we do know Paul would go to these Bible studies and he'd talk to people and teach them about Jesus. And I was thrilled by this because as we're talking about how we're moving as a church in the future, and we want to have more of these life groups, Bible studies, house churches, whatever we're going to call them as they evolve, being there learning together. Kind of like we're doing now, except not as much interaction as they were doing here. But that's what we want to promote. So maybe you might be saying, well, look, if I was brave or as dedicated as these, then maybe God would just use me in a different way. And I think Paul would say, no, that's kind of an excuse. You're missing the point of what the scriptures tell us. You'll never be as brave until you realize that Jesus has changed you, and you realize that, and then I have nothing to be afraid of. I have nothing to lose. And I mean, because maybe we're thinking about our reputations. Maybe we're thinking about, hey, this is somebody that I want to get to know because it's somebody that has connections that I need. I don't want to lose that, so I don't want to introduce, don't talk about faith and don't talk about politics. I want to maintain friendships here. But I just wonder, is it taking that risk, does that lead to transformation? Yeah, it does. I can't deny that. I can't. So when we see Jesus doing this, changing lives, it humbles us and it empowers us. And I think too, if we're around people or if we live our life saying you got to live the Bible this way and you try to obey the Bible on your own, it'll crush you. You can't do it. It's hard for me, I'll speak for myself, to forgive a person that's hurt me right away. It's hard for me to see people in need and try to meet their need right away. I look around at our homeless situation here in Seattle. I don't know what to do. I guess our city doesn't know what to do either, but that's a whole other conversation. But what's our role? What does it look like? How do we deal with that? And so I think when we understand the peace of God and the kind of peace that passes all of our understanding and justifications, then we'll say, I need Jesus, or better, I want Jesus in my life, and I choose to then to submit my life to him. that's the change. That's the transformation. That's where it all begins to look different. The world has a different color to it than how we've seen it or what we're afraid of. So that's Lydia, okay? Somebody who had it all together and yet felt like she missed something. And then we come to this slave girl, and she was, some commentators say she was this oracle of Delphi. So she was a prophet in Greek legend, and so people who followed the oracle of Delphi were like guarded by a python. So I'm just giving you all the weird imagery, which, I think a lot of people in our society find that more believable than Jesus being born to a virgin, dying, and resurrecting. So I'll throw it out there. When in those days a person would fall into trances or go into fits or speak in strange voices and prophesy the future, the people would say, oh, that person has the spirit of the python. And that's what was happening to this slave girl in this story. And here it is. She followed Paul and the others around, and she was shouting at them, saying, "These men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved." And she kept this up for many days, just following these guys around the city, just yelling at them. And finally, Paul became so annoyed, and I think that's something really key to listen to, because a lot of times we think, oh, the great people of faith, they don't get annoyed, they don't get frustrated, they don't get mad. Paul's like, you know what, this is bugging the, can I say crap? Out of me. And he turned around and said to her, "In the name of Jesus, I command you to come out of her." And at that moment, the spirit left her. So it's one of those stories, I'd like to see that, to be honest. That's kind of an interesting thing to observe. So I thought it was kind of clever, and how Luke wrote, Paul was annoyed. Paul was ticked. And so because people believed at the time that this slave girl accurately predicted the future, people would pay her a lot of money to her master for her services. Okay? And so, and they made a lot of money at that time. And so, how did she find Jesus? Well, a lot different than Lydia. She's poor, she's a slave, she's demon-possessed and oppressed economically and socially. She's trafficked, if you will, modern day. So she needs a power encounter with Jesus. And that use of words, power encounter, I think is so appropriate today. A lot of times when I would think about that when I was growing up in church world and I'd hear power encounter, I'd roll my eyes. What is somebody's going to fall over or whatever? But I'm thinking in our day and age today, we need a power encounter. We need an experience with God to show us that God is real. I look for that. I want that. I need that. So, because the Bible tells us, the scriptures tell us that we were spiritually enslaved before Jesus comes in order to bring wealth to our soul and to our spirit. How does that work? Well, I found this, somebody recommended that I read this commencement speech by this guy named David Foster Wallace. Anybody heard of him? Yeah. He's very young, very smart guy. He's passed away at a young age, but I thought this was really interesting, and I grabbed a quote from him, and this is what he said. So, this is David Foster Wallace. There is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship, and the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. If you worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you in the ground, he says. Worship power, you will end up feeling weak and afraid. And you will need ever more power over others to numb you to your own fear. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. But the insidious thing about these forms of worship is not that they're evil or sinful, it's that they're unconscious. They are default settings. So in other words, he's saying, look, let's be realistic. Everybody lives for something. And a lot of times, good things, family, being good at my career, a lover, my children. And when we elevate those things to any kind of level above the only thing that won't crush us, God, we'll never feel like we measure up. So it's noble to love your family, but if you put your children above anything else, you will always worry. You'll always be anxious. You'll always be nervous if you're going to offend them or not, rather than worshiping God. And God gives us great, great promises about our kids. If you worship a spouse or a friend or whatever, meaning you put them higher above God, you will crush them with expectations. So if it's not the real God, I think he's right. It will eat you alive. You'll be filled with anxiety. And the message of Jesus really is the only master that when you get him, you will totally be satisfied. You won't want more. The only thing you want more of is to be in his presence. So God created the world, and he created you and me for himself. And secondly, if you fail this master, the insidious ones, they will keep wanting more. If you fail the master Jesus, he will die for you regardless. A career, a spouse, a friend, family can't do that. Unless you come under the liberating lordship of Jesus, you will be spiritually oppressed. And I just want to stop here and say, why am I talking about all of this? Because I really believe that where we live in the United States, where we live in the city of Seattle, we need to live transformed lives like this. This is what makes the church attractive. This is what makes the church be the place of hope and healing, and not a political engagement society where make sure we vote for the right things because that's our Christian duty. I don't read that anywhere. And so what does it look like for you to be transformed like this? To be a person, maybe you've got everything together. Do you? Or maybe you are a slave to something else. How do you break free of that? And then finally, here's the jailer. Let me read his story, because Paul's in prison again, and because they called this girl out, the owner of the slave girl had them thrown in prison, and it goes like this. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them, and there was a violent earthquake, and the foundations of the prison were shaken. All at once, the prison doors flew open. And the jailer called for lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And they just said, "Look, believe in Jesus, and you'll be okay." And a quick background of the jailer. Interesting thing about him, he was probably an ex-Roman soldier. He got government jobs upon military retirement, so he was set. Paul and Silas, when they were thrown into jail, were beaten to an inch of their life and thrown into prison. The jailer, though isn't as broken as the slave girl, nor as put together as Lydia, the businesswoman, he doesn't need money. He isn't an intellect, nor does he need the power encounter that the slave girl got. He's pretty much a practical guy. Probably tells dirty jokes, drinks hard, cynical, seen it all. He's that guy. But he has this practical encounter of how Jesus can change your life. He's listening to Paul and Silas sing hymns. They're worshiping. They're having church. Paul and Silas are liberated, and they understand the freedom that comes by serving Christ. So the scene is, it's nighttime, there's an earthquake, the gates open, and one thing that culturally happened, if prisoners escaped under your watch as the jailer, you were killed. So that's why he's freaking out. That's why he comes to them and he falls before them trembling, going, there's something here, I want it. And the jailer gets ready to take his own life, and Paul yells out, "Look, we're here, man, it's all good. Don't do anything." So the jailer knows Paul sacrificed his freedom to save his life, because Paul and Silas didn't run out, they stayed. Nobody ever did anything that radical for this jailer. He only knows evil for evil, eye for an eye. Now he sees these guys full of joy and freedom and love, and he's saying, "What is it, man? What do you have? How do I get this?" So the jailer bowed his head, invited Christ in. Lydia needed a rational encounter. The slave girl needed a power encounter. And the jailer needed to see the practical work of Jesus. So what did we learn? And I'll close with these three things. This message is for everybody. A businesswoman, a slave girl, a middle-class guy. Classes are all different. We're all different, come from different races in society. Christianity is not limited to one people group. It's not for white people. It's not just for white evangelical people that have decent jobs and are just nice and live in suburbs. It's for everybody, no matter what their class is. In fact, as the world is radically changing and moving, most Christians in the world come from Asian countries, African countries, and Latin American countries. I mean, the United States is becoming more of a minority in that. We're not the leader in Christian. Our country is founded on Christian principles. No, it really wasn't. It was founded by deists who had an understanding of a God and thought that this is a way for us to be moral and ethical in the way we form the country together. So it wasn't Christian principles. It was religious, if you will. So there's no one who can say Christianity is not for me. It's for everybody. Two, it's a unifying power for the world. I heard a great commentary from a pastor, I think I mentioned this last week, of a big church down in Atlanta. His name's Andy Stanley. And he said the enemy of the church is disunity. And I think we all know that's what we're seeing, right? Because we think of political engagements, we think of how we view the world and everything like that, and there's more of the separation than there is unity, and even within our churches. I'm very grateful for our church. We haven't had much of that. We haven't had much a lot of controversy with regard to disunity, but I think it's all the more important to understand that how important unity is, and this is what the gospel message does. It brings us all together. So the three people that these case studies, if they would have lived in Seattle today, Lydia would be a CEO of her own company living on Highland Drive here in Queen Anne. The slave girl would be a 16-year-old drug-addicted runaway living on Capitol Hill. And the jailer would be a blue-collar cop living on Beacon Hill. How's that? Breaking it down. Yeah? There should be applause for that because that was an amazing breakdown. But we're all good. Probably these people would never have crossed paths. That's why I love Jesus' church. Probably all of us even sitting in the room now, even listening, would never cross paths unless we weren't here for one common unifying reason. Although they were worlds apart, the same message of Christ changed them and brought them to the same church, the same life group, the same house church. Our city tries to pride itself on diversity. I have an opinion there, but I'll leave it alone. But groups don't get along very well, do we? They stay apart. The gospel is the unifier. It crosses all barriers, and as a Christ follower, you just don't view people as a class or race or status. It's people, it's a soul. And I think, when somebody comes at you and says, well, this is who I am, you can say, hey, that's great, but I also see you as a fellow soul-bearing human being, so we can be on the same plane, same team, if you will. And I would say this, if you call yourself a Christ follower, that's who you are. Everything else is second. I follow Jesus. He's my God and my Savior. I live in America. I live in the city of Seattle. Or maybe I should say, I have Iranian descent. And then I'm an American, all that. I'm kind of proud of that, So, but it's seeing ourselves as who we are first. And if we're Christ followers, then really it comes back to how am I living my life to honor this God that I worship? And finally, God's going to work through you even though you may have made mistakes or, we're all wrecked. We all have things. And God will work through us regardless. I don't know what to say to people. I don't want to really talk to people about this, if you will. I don't have answers. Good. All of that's good. So then how do you live your life? I think it's important that we just keep our heart open to what Jesus wants to do in our life, how he wants to talk to us and encourage us and love us, and then moves us to action. What does that look like for you? I don't know. It looks different for everybody. But I think the important thing is, are we living this out? Though we're flawed, though we make mistakes, though we do and say dumb things, God's the one who goes after people. He uses us despite of that, and that's important. And for us to be a church in this new way, the new, sorry, the cliche, the world is different. It's changed. The city's different. The church is different. And as a church, we are moving toward understanding what that means and how do we reimagine the church to be a church in the city that we're in and be a church for this neighborhood. Seattle needs what this church is. I believe that. So what does that look like for you? We talked about, the giving a 12-month commitment starting in January, praying, participating, and partnering. So what part of that is for you as you think of your life as a follower of Jesus, which is first, before you are an attender to All Saints? So let me pray, and then we'll take communion and close. So Jesus, we thank you for today. Thank you that you are the transformer, that when we let you in and when you get in our soul, everything changes from the inside out. And Lord, I just pray that we wouldn't be passive about that. We would look for it. We would look for stories. We look for opportunities. We would not feel good about giving in whatever form that looks like. We wouldn't just feel good about, I prayed for somebody. But God, we'd feel good about the fact that we get to participate with you in everything. I thank you for everybody here. I thank you for everybody listening. I thank you for our city. I thank you for our country. I thank you for what you're doing across the world. And God, I pray we look for those things and see them. In Jesus' name, amen.